research that you did. You did a whole part of a big research study.
We did a survey.
We can't hear you.
We did a political survey of Jewish voters in Los Angeles.
Okay, so is
this not on? Hello? No. Yes, we did a survey of Los Angeles County Jewish voters in 2019. Yeah.
So Michael's prepared some questions to start us off. Have you?
Yeah, I was going to give you some introductory remarks, which you completely stole, but that's fine.
I thought you said you wanted. Okay.
No. So what we're going to try to do, maybe some of you are aware of the fact that the U.S. and the world are kind of in crazy times right now. And we wanted to have a little bit of a conversation about looking at all the stuff that's going on somewhat through a Jewish lens and how that affects us, how we should think about it. So I think we're going to kind of start right there. I think we're going to touch on U.S. politics. We'll touch on the Supreme Court. And we'll talk about the midterms. Maybe we'll have a peek looking at 2024. And then Rafe will talk you off the ledge before we open it up for some questions. So we're a month out from the midterms. Let's talk a little bit about what's at stake for American Jews. Maybe we can look at the myth of United States Jews voting as a monolith, which we don't think that's true. And then talk about the main issues that are of concern to Jews, and then the issues that maybe Jews should be concerned about. So, Rafe, you want to start, just give us kind of an overview of, just jump in anywhere and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all. This is a real walk on the wild side, one of the few in-person events I have done in the last 2.5 years. And in honor of that, I went into my closet and found a jacket. No. However, the first one I took, I walked out the door and realized there was a hole in the back. Went running back inside, found this one, and I wish I could say that it fits perfectly, but the 2 years have, let's just say, led to changes in the world and in myself. But anyway, I'm wearing it, so I'm very proud of myself. I have, however, not touched my ties, and I want to see if in the next few months I can go without ever wearing a tie again. That would be, this is not working, so I think I'm going to do this. Is that better? Okay. You've probably heard people say, this is the most important election of your lifetime. I think you've probably heard that now for about 4 straight elections. Now, first I'm going to talk you onto the ledge, maybe off the ledge, then back off the ledge. Every one of those elections where you were told that, it's actually correct. And it's going to be that way for a while. Might as well get used to it. And the reason for that is we're enmeshed, both in this country and worldwide, in a back and forth between competing forms of government that is going to go on for quite a while. It's very significant for all of us. Whether you're in Italy, whether you're in Germany, whether you're in Russia, Sweden, all throughout the world, Brazil, there's a big battle about whether what's called liberal democracy, not the same as liberal ideology, it's a different term. Liberal democracy can survive in the world with all the transitions we're going through, both demographically and politically. We've been going through that in this country at a profound level since Barack Obama's election in 2008, which historians are going to look back and say that's the beginning of the era we're in right now. How do I know that? Because as a political scientist, I'm finding myself less and less drawn to the work of my peers who wrote before Barack Obama was elected. Because we're really in a time where politics is driven as much by identity as by interests, as much by who you are versus the policies that you support. And the problem for the Jewish community is it places the Jewish community in kind of a choice position from time to time between alternatives that are not perfect. And that does cause a lot of kind of angst in the Jewish community. And a lot of that circles around Israel. and the American Jewish support for Israel in a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, and also anti-Israel sentiment is on the rise. And those are not always from the same people, but there's, obviously there's going to be some overlap. And coming to terms with what it means to be an American Jewish voter who is deeply concerned about Israel, which I would count as myself, means that there's times when you feel a little bit at sea, not too sure about certain things out there in the world. What's going to happen for the next few elections is competing forces in this country around the nexus of what we'd call identity are going to be fighting for control of the national government, the state governments, the county governments, and the city governments for the foreseeable future. So when I talk to my adult kids who say, you told me the last election was the most important, I say, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not going to do this with you retail, one election at a time. The next 5 elections are going to be the most important of your life. Let's just get that out of the way so that I don't have to do it next time. But at the end of the day, it's not always going to be like this. And that's why I want to pull you off the ledge a little bit. That's never a good thing, because I think if I pull you off the ledge, you could fall. I mean, I want you to come back in from the ledge, is what I'm saying. Like all conflicts that seem eternal, this one won't be eternal. But it's not going to go away next week. It's not going to go away with the election results. It's not going to go away in 2024. But in time, the issues will change. We will all change. The things we think are important will change. And most of all, we will probably come to terms with most of the identity changes that are causing so much conflict in this country. Will begin to seem like, what were we so excited about? Why were these so controversial? So in time is going to make a big difference on this. However, you'd be crazy not to vote, which is not something you would ordinarily have to tell a Jewish audience. I used to tell graduate students that the dissertation not to write is Jewish non-voting. What a waste of time. I mean, the Jewish voter turnout is just astronomical. But I would say it used to be just civic duty that would do it, but now you really have to vote. You cannot not weigh in.
So let me push back a little bit on your time frame. In time, you said things will kind of find their own equilibrium, but in the next 10 years or so, there's such a rise in Christian nationalism, in domestic terrorism, in ways that our democracy has been stretched, if not broken, that we've never seen before. And the internet is now littered with references to the coming civil war. Talk about a little bit about, it won't be like the Civil War of 170 years ago, but it might be a very different and equally dangerous type of civil war.
Well, look, there's plenty to worry about on that front. Conflict is very severe, and the more you consume vast amounts of media information, the less able you will be to process all that information and stay okay. I'll tell you what I do. I don't actually watch a lot of stuff. I think I'm one of the most well-informed people about American politics there is, and I don't watch cable TV news. I don't take anything seriously I see on social media unless it's been confirmed 3 or 4 days later by an actual legitimate news source. And I'm actually calmer than a lot of my friends who don't have as much information, but they're getting too much incoming information. The truth of the matter is there are very serious worries about political violence coming forward in this country. I don't think it will be political violence like the Confederate rebellion against the United States government in 1861. It'll have some similarities to it, quite a few similarities. But it's not going to be that there's going to be an army raised of hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are going to set up a new government, but there will be individual cases of domestic terrorism. I will say this is the first time in modern times we've actually recognized that that's domestic terrorism. It's actually been in place for quite some time, but the US government was very, very nervous about labeling it that way. It's actually a positive development that we're now starting to pay attention to it. And as law enforcement, for the first time, begins to really focus on it, I think a certain amount of it is going to be handled through just traditional law enforcement. And once people start getting arrested and prosecuted and tried and imprisoned, That's going to make a big difference. That hadn't been happening before. So I'm not a ridiculous optimist, but I do know enough about the Civil War to know what that was. It was the bloodiest war in the history of the United States when you add up all the soldiers who were killed. I don't think we're going there, and I think calling it a civil war, but I would say the potential for violence is there. Episodic, one thing at a time, and worth being very careful about. And obviously in synagogues, we're very concerned about the security of synagogues. I don't take that lightly at all. And I think those are the kind of worries that I think are very realistic.
Let me turn the prism a little bit. If Obama had not been elected in 2008, if it had been another Democrat who won, do you think the level of friction, conflict, changes in behavior, the lack of civility, and all the things attached to that would have been as strident as they are now if we'd have had a different, i.e. white president elected in 2008?
One of two people were going to be elected president in 2008. It was going to be Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. The Republican candidate did not have a chance in that election. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, there would have been a very different but perhaps equal level that would have been more around gender issues. And she was already treated as a very polarizing figure, but gender is a big part of what's going on right now. It's not just about race. So you kind of pick your polarization. You know, you could argue that it would lead with race, but race was going to be part of it even if Hillary Clinton had been elected. Because what we're fighting about in this country is the proper role of racial and gender identity in the United States. That's identity politics, and that is about where people live. And I don't mean just geographically, but where they live, about their heart, not just about their position on the minimum wage. But these are profound issues. Either one of those candidates was going to open up an era, because Donald Trump can be understood as the reaction to that election. In fact, you can't understand Donald Trump without understanding both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So they both represented a kind of change that will eventually come. But the transition to that change is leading to a lot of what you're seeing right now in our country's politics.
So that leads to my next question. The Democrats and the Republicans each have very different issues in the midterms they're running on. Are they a function purely of politics to play to their base, or do these represent sincere, authentic concerns that they want to address? I mean, Republicans talk about crime, immigration, and inflation. Democrats are talking about abortion, low unemployment, and maybe a handful of other things. They're not talking to each other right now. So how does a voter make a decision based on almost a complete separation of issues that are important to them?
Well, actually, if I could reframe what you said, Michael. In politics, you win elections not by winning arguments and not by persuading anybody. The only thing you want to persuade them about is what's important. That's how you win elections. So if you run an election where you're the president's party and in a midterm and you run it on the president's performance, you're going to be destroyed. By the way, it doesn't matter who the president is. You're going to be destroyed because you can never disprove the negative about your performance. You always run it on your issue. And you grapple. In fact, I wish more people understood this. You don't grapple by having old-fashioned Lincoln-Douglas debates from the 1850s. You grapple over what issues we're going to argue about. And that's how you win. This is where the Supreme Court made a fatal political miscalculation for the Republican Party. The Republican Party has wanted to overturn Roe versus Wade for 30, 40 years, and the plan was to overturn it after the midterm elections, because the midterms were going exactly the way the Republicans wanted. It was about the economy. It was a referendum on President Biden. Inflation was up. It was just great, and when those don't work, you run some ads on crime. I mean, it's a formula that you can actually do in the Republican Party between 9 and 5 and then go watch a bowl game. I mean, it's not really that hard to do. So they were coasting. And if you looked at the numbers earlier in the year, the gap was getting bigger and bigger. Democrats were facing a complete catastrophe. And the Supreme Court, despite the request from John Roberts, the Chief Justice, who tried to get them to agree to not quite do it, they had the votes at that moment, and they did it. And they're going to regret that for about the next 25 years. They're regretting it right now because the Democratic Party is driven by women, not the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is. As women go, the Democratic Party goes. If Democratic women are energized, the Democratic Party is energized. If they're not, the Democratic Party is not energized. Well, nobody anticipated that Kansas would vote by a gigantic majority to enshrine abortion rights into the state constitution. It's rather unbelievable. The wave of new registrations from women who are registering to vote has got Republicans very worried, and suddenly the midterm looks different. The midterm looks different not because people changed their minds, but because what the election's about changed. So when it switched from the economy, inflation, et cetera, to abortion, and then threats to democracy, and then God's greatest gift to the Democratic Party, which is Donald Trump. Every day Donald Trump is in the news is a day that Democrats don't like to watch Donald Trump, but hard-boiled Democrats say, can he be in the news more? Can we pick a fight with him? Can we say something to get under his skin, which is really not very difficult to do? So Trump certainly mobilizes Republicans. There's no question about that, but not to the degree that he mobilizes Democrats. So Democrats are running on, by the way, do you know that Democrats until this year would not use the word abortion? I don't have to tell you the Democratic Party is not the world's most aggressive political party. They're very nice, and I respect that because nice people are good, although Leo DeRocher once said, nice guys finish last, was that famous baseball manager, which Democrats have done their best to prove Leo DeRocher right forever. They referred to it as reproductive rights, which of course everybody on earth knows what that means. But they were told by their wonderful consultants, who should have been fired 25 years ago, don't ever mention the word abortion because it freaks people out. Honestly, it doesn't seem to freak out Democratic women voters to actually use the A word. Now, it's funny to watch them change because now the Democratic consultants lecture us about how they knew all along that this is the strategy. And a lot of us are laughing because people have been saying, when are you going to actually get this? So now Democrats are using the word all the time. And they look like excited, like a kid who's learned to curse for the first time. You know, they're like saying the word. And they're pushing, and this goes all the way into the LA mayor's race. Because what I'm discovering is that US politics, global politics, where Vladimir Putin talks about the same social issues that are talked about in American politics. And in LA's mayor's race and in other races, who is most pro-choice is a very important place to be. Now, because it's a very democratic city, the argument is who is the most pro-choice. It's not more like the national thing going on. So, but you asked the question, are the people at the top kind of idealists and thoughtful and highly principled? Well, folks, do they have to be? I mean, I hate to tell you, I've been working in and around politics my whole life. Politics is a profession, and you try to be good at it. What really matters to me is not the politicians. What matters to me is the voters, the people. And I've always believed that the people follow their sincere beliefs. They really do. Now, sometimes the people at the top figure out how to get us to do things that maybe they shouldn't get us to do. But I've always put my faith in the voters more than in the politicians anyway.
Do you find that that this year and maybe 2 years hence, it seems to me people are, so many of the issues are beyond facts. They play to people's emotions, and people are voting or believing issues based on their emotions. For example, crime is actually down. Violent crime is actually down, and even in the 5 biggest cities, the murder rate is down. But yet, you'd think the country was you know, it is awash in arms, but you'd think it was just blood all over the place. So I'm wondering if, in this our current era, if people are more willing to ignore facts, it's just how they feel about the candidate or an issue.
I don't know. You see, I'm a believer in emotion. I don't think emotion necessarily takes you too far off facts, and there might be some part of us that can know how you're going too far without the facts. God, when I was growing up, they had all these debate clubs, and everything was supposed to be on fact, and you scored points depending on, and everybody who learned that too well turned out to be a terrible political candidate later on, because they were scoring points while the other person was speaking to your heart. If there's one field in life that should speak to your heart, it's politics. It's not just about your head. Now, crime is one of those issues where I'm kind of buffeted. It depends which crimes are down and which ones are not down. So the data is not always quite clear on that. But we react very emotionally to crime. Crime is wrong, especially not necessarily a number question. So crime in politics works. I think sometimes it's vastly overstated, how it is. But in periods where crime really declined dramatically, it was harder to run campaigns on crime. But the voters don't recognize those changes until they're really big changes. We sort of watch for a while, and then we see. This is why, just to segue to something like homelessness, which is, of course, the principal issue in LA, people aren't going to notice improvement in the situation in homelessness in LA until they see a big improvement. So if you write an article that says, good news, it's down 1.5%, voters are going to say, call me when something interesting happens. Don't waste my time now. I got kids, I got a family, I got stuff to do, I got to get to work. But boy, if it goes down 30%, 40%, or as in Houston, it went down 65%, you bet people are going to notice that. So we look at big things. Big things get our attention.
Okay, so...
Michael, could we just have a little bit of Jewish?
I was just getting to
He was just getting there.
I actually was. That was going to be
I was feeling it.
Very next question. What are there specific issues that the Jewish community should be concerned about or aware of, or be a little more interested in this year?
So not to advertise something I wrote a long time ago, but this is a cover story, 2019, about our survey of LA Jews. And it was it was one of the largest surveys of LA Jews that's ever been done in one community. And we found, not surprisingly, that Jews are way more likely to identify as Democrats than as Republicans, that Jews were very disapproving of Donald Trump, but a minority of Jews are Republican and liked Trump, and that there were significant differences between Orthodox Jews and non-Orthodox Jews, although we surveyed enough people that we found divergencies among Orthodox Jews in their views. So look, we're not a monolithic group, but a few broad things stand out. On social issues, Jews are more liberal even than they are Democrats. So if I could just unpack that for you a little bit. Jews are maybe 2.5, 3-to-1 Democratic over Republican in Los Angeles, but in support of abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and issues like that, Jews are way above their Democratic level, which means a lot of Republican Jews are socially liberal. It's just, by the way, the #1 pro-reproductive rights, pro-choice group in the United States are Jewish women. So there's that. There's that one issue. But you have other issues where it gets a little bit more complicated. And one of the most interesting ones is the issue of Israel. And I have just spent years thinking through a few things about the connection between American Jews and Israeli Jews, and the connection between Jewish liberalism and support of Israel in the context where support for Israel is kind of in jeopardy in the United States. And where does that leave Jewish voters in this country? And the third one, that is a very unifying thing among Jews is fear of anti-Semitism. Our survey found a large increase in fear of anti-Semitism compared to the last surveys that have been done more than 20 years before this survey was done. It's jumped up. What a surprise. Again, facts are real and they affect emotion. It has gone up because anti-Semitism as a hate crime has clearly gone up. But Israel is the really interesting one because even Israel's stance in this world that's going on, that's transitioning, Israel's trying to find its way among these contending forces of liberal democracy and authoritarian government. I came to a lot of conclusions about Israel in the course of my life and developing politically. And I made a lot of friends with people from Israel so we could compare notes. I could explain American politics to them and they could explain Israeli politics to me. They never quite succeeded in that second part. But it's a parliamentary system, which is completely different because the same prime minister disappears one day and 2 years later they're back and then they're gone again. And you think I was just getting to know you, you know, and this is typical of parliamentary systems, not like the American system. But I came to the conclusion that it was okay for me to support Israel and occasionally and sometimes a lot of times disagree with Israeli policies, but to also recognize that I don't have a vote in Israel's government and that Israel is a state trying to survive. And therefore, I took a step back and said, I'm not necessarily going to take the position that I get to control everything that Israel does. And sometimes I explain to people that Israel is sometimes just a country, and countries do things to survive. This is a battle I've had in my own political debates for so many years, because so much of my political work was in other communities than the Jewish community. And I was always trying to sort of be an ambassador and explain that a bit. So in our survey, we asked Jewish voters if they supported Israel. We knew that was a very difficult question to ask, so we gave it 4 parts. Number 1, I support Israel and I support the policies of the Israeli government. Number 4, on the other end, was I don't support Israel. You're allowed to have that position. You might get in an argument with me, but you can have that position. Number 2 was I support Israel, but disagree with a number of policies of Israel. And number 3 was I support Israel and I disagree with a lot of policies. Now, what's wonderful about this is you can add these up any way you want. If you take 1, 2, and 3, do you support Israel, you're looking at 90%. If you look at support everything Israel does, you're at 19%. Don't support Israel, you're at 10%, which is pretty small. And about a third each picked number 2 and number 3, which means the majority of Jewish voters felt comfortable saying, I support Israel, even if that means I don't agree with everything that Israel does. I can live with that as an arrangement. Now, I wouldn't say that result would be very popular in Israel, where the assumption is that number 1 should be 100%, but that's not realistic. It's just not realistic, but it's not bad. A separate question asked about support for Israel's survival as a Jewish state, which is a different question, by the way. Very high support in the LA Jewish community for that. In other words, on the things that really are make or break, the Jewish community has sort of taken a stand on that. Now, now switch to anti-Semitism. This is where we want to go, I think.
Not
Terrible, not yet?
Not yet. I was going to get to that.
Let Michael ask me that, and then I will answer that.
I want to ask you one question about this area we're talking about, where you said that Jews tend to be more liberal than Democrat, and I'm wondering, as you
only on social issues.
on social issues,
yeah.
okay. Do progressive Democrats run the risk of losing Jewish support because some of them have been very, very critical of the West Bank situation?
Most Jewish elected officials, like in the House, the Senate, the state legislature, are very supportive of Israel, even when it sometimes gets them in trouble with their allies in other communities. So, which goes to another question. it's still important to have Jewish elected officials in office. For the same reason other communities need their representatives in office, because sometimes you want people in office, doesn't have to be a majority, but people who have at heart the very specific concerns of that community in their mind. This is why for so long when we had such homogeneous office holding in this country, it was such a problem because there was nobody to speak for each community. I like knowing that there's people in office who share my general political point of view, but also have a specific interest in not falling into delegitimizing Israel. So I don't think you see that much. Now, what you would see, you could imagine alienating Jewish voters by trying to build on the social liberalism of Jewish voters and assuming that carries into every single thing going out there. And Jewish voters will turn against Democratic candidates throughout the country who they perceive as not just sometimes critical of Israel, but really going, look, everybody gets to draw their own red lines, right? And voters have the right to do that anytime they want, but sometimes you'll find somebody getting to the point where you say, now wait a minute, it sounds to me like you're saying Israel shouldn't exist. You're losing my vote. And some of those folks have actually lost seats as a result of that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
You sort of surrounded it, but that works.
That's my goal.
So let's turn to anti-Semitism. The incidents between 2020 and 2021 rose 34%, the highest level they've been in 40 years. I think we all have our own ideas about how and why that occurred. But I'm wondering, when we look back on November 10th or whenever all the final results are in after the midterms this year, and a lot of states will elect, a lot of districts will elect some pretty far-right people who don't necessarily embrace Jews. Do you see this? Do you see the number of anti-Semitism incidents rising? Do you think it's going to level off? I mean, it sort of reflects the tone of the country and how fractured we are. But where do you see us on that timeline?
Well, first of all, just to go back again to our Jewish voters in LA, because remember, I like the voices of the voters. People were concerned about two different types of anti-Semitism that are really quite different from each other, even have different roots. One, which is more predominant in the white, is the right, is the historic demonization of Jews as a group. Not Israel, but Jews. And that worries me that I'm seeing that in Europe as well, because if I could take a sidelight for a minute, what disturbs me is that we know so much more in this country about the history of communism than we do about fascism. How many movies have been made about the Cold War, about Russian spies, the Americans? By the way, one of the greatest television shows ever made. But that show was successful because we all had a sense, we understood the Russians, we understood the Soviet Union, we understood what communism was. There are very few people alive today who remember the route to fascism in the 1930s, and there's only some people who heard about it from their parents, as I did, and a number of us did. So as a lot of things repeat themselves that seem so new, they don't look new at all if you read the history of the 1930s, and one of those is the rise of Jews as a target. And you can look for certain phrases, like I think it was the new person in Italy said that those financial speculators will not be, every group has their own things. You'd be amazed, and one of the things, we surveyed not just Jews, but African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, each had their own survey. Every group has their own things that only they hear. It's like tuned to a tuning fork. From the time I was a kid, when I heard words financial speculator, I knew what it was. And then you'd say to somebody, they just meant Jews, and they say, I didn't mean that. I just don't like Wall Street. I said, no. Anyway, we're getting into great arguments. I was one of those kids in elementary school who got into political arguments with people. So, the fact is, that kind of anti-Semitism is picking up steam. And it's really frightening because it does have a direct connection to violence. So when you're thinking about violence, I think that's the type of anti-Semitism we're seeing coming in that direction, aimed not against Israel at all. In fact, it sometimes is in the guise of being very pro-Israel, but not very big on Jews, which has always struck me as a kind of an anomalous kind of thing to quite figure that out. But in fairness, when you look on the other side, people in our survey were also concerned about attitudes about Israel that were not particularly anti-Jewish, but if Israel is a Jewish state that's deeply valued by Jews, it's not much comfort to say, you know, maybe Israel shouldn't exist, but it's not because we don't want Jews to have, you know, to live in peace and prosperity. Well, you know, at a certain point, doesn't that get kind of like a distinction without a difference? It is not more likely in the US to lead to political violence, because it's not aimed at Jews specifically, but Jews are concerned about both of those. In answer to your question, I think if authoritarian movements keep going, which I'm not convinced they will be as successful as it appears right now, I think Jews are going to be a part of the landscape of those conversations, even in countries that have very few Jews. By the way, you want to know something weird about anti-group attitudes? They're often most prevalent in countries that don't have very many. And in this country, the counties that are most anti-immigrant are the counties with the fewest immigrants. And that tells you that a lot of our attitudes, this goes back to your fact question to argue against my own position from before, are based on fantasies, based on a lack of contact and information. So people who have had very little experience of diverse populations often express the greatest hostility to those populations, which means all they're relying on is something they saw on TV or heard from somebody. Direct experience usually, it really does improve things a lot.
But that sort of touches on why our country is so bifurcated between Democrats largely in urban areas, Republicans largely in rural areas, because there's been a self-segregation of the races in terms of what they're comfortable with and what they don't want to be around.
Didn't quite happen that way. If I might, the rural areas depopulated, basically, and that is happening in the whole world. This is not just in the United States. Everywhere you go in advanced countries around the world, the rural populations are pouring into the cities. In our country, we have a constitution that never adjusted for that, and as a result, the rural areas have about 10 times the political power of the urban areas and believe themselves to be utterly powerless, which is a hell of a combination when you think about it for aggressive politics, which is we are getting the short end of the stick and we're going to use whatever little bit of power we have to frustrate those of you in the urban areas. With the urban areas, California has 2 senators with 40 million people. Rhode Island has about 4 people, and half of them are senators. It is possible to completely gerrymander our constitution so that the places losing population that are the most homogeneous have actually the most disproportionate power. We wouldn't be in trouble, by the way, if they knew they had that power and felt pretty good about it. Instead, they feel terrible. The real area that's going to determine the midterm elections is not the urban areas and it is not the rural areas. It's the suburban areas that are in the rings around big metro areas. 20 years ago, those were the base of the Republican Party nationwide, when the Republicans were very strong, much stronger than they are today. Those areas that surround big metro areas now are voting Democratic to a much higher level. But not all the way, and some of it depends on white suburban women and whether they will vote Republican this year or whether they will vote as a result of Roe versus Wade. I don't know the answer to that, but it's going to determine, it's not going to be the rural areas and it's not even going to be the urban areas, it's going to be those suburban areas are going to really make the difference.
But let me just try to clarify one thing you said about the Electoral College and the representation principally in the Senate. The rural states, like all the big square states in the West, their representation hasn't changed. I mean, they've always had their 2 senators. irrespective of what their populations were. It's only more recently that the disparity between representation is so blatant now that we see it, like Wyoming having 2 senators and California having 2, and we have 40 million people, and they don't even have 1 million people.
It's just gotten more extreme. Okay. I mean, it was always true. And also, consider this, that in earlier decades, Republicans were just as strong as Democrats in some of those big blue states. California used to be a Republican state in presidential elections.
Arizona was a Democrat state.
New York was not always a Democratic state in presidential elections. So essentially, what happened is the parties sorted themselves into states. Democratic states gained population but didn't gain representation proportional to that. And that probably can't go on for too much longer, because what it creates is a situation of minority rule. And Jewish voters happen to live, I'm just going to make sure to get that in there, happen to live in those big metro areas to a large degree. So essentially, this has to do with how the Supreme Court ended up the way it is, with its majority right now. And I will tell you, there have been a couple of Jewish women on the Supreme Court who have had a very big impact. I don't know if you remember the famous thing that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked. Remember when she was asked what would be the ideal number of women on the Supreme Court?
9.
She said 9. Which, by the way, I thought was hilarious in 2 ways. One, because it's absolutely hilarious in its own, but it flips the script that it seemed so normal that there were no women on for the longest time, and nobody said, what's the right number of men to have on the Supreme Court? And somebody said, well, I don't know. How about 9? The system just produced it as if that was normal. So she was flipping the whole thing. She was really quite a character. I have to say, the subtext of the Supreme Court arguments going on is the women against the men. 3 of the women against 5 men and 1 woman. And the women keep getting bolder and bolder in their challenges, because one of the things about coming into politics as a group that hasn't really been well represented is you're over polite when you first come in. It's like, well, I'll wait for my turn to speak, you know, and then when we do, we'll be very collegial. Well, I can tell you, that gets you nowhere. So I don't know if you saw Justice Jackson 48 hours ago take the entire theory of originalism and say, well, I don't know, if you're going to say we should use the original intent, how about if we actually read what they said? She didn't say it that way, because she's a very nice, very polite person. She basically eviscerated an argument that's been floating around forever, that, you know, about which, you can't just pick the era when something was happening because you'd like to have that conclusion, but you might actually want to do some reading on the history of the 14th Amendment. It was actually embarrassing to the other justices. And we'll see. I have a feeling it may actually affect the decision they make in a particular voting rights case. So, but the Supreme Court has a 6-3 majority for positions that are opposed by a majority of the voters in the country.
Well, that was clear in the abortion decision.
But what that means is that's how democratic systems get into crisis. And there have been clearly times when Democrats have overreached, and that has created a crisis in the system. There's no question about that. Because when you're out of whack with what the country believes, you create a crisis. And you can do one of 2 things. You can back down, which is what you should do, which is what the Supreme Court did in 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt threatened to increase the size of the Supreme Court. Within a year, one of the Supreme Court justices had changed their vote, and it was referred to as the switch in time that saved 9. So the truth is, the court could still back down in the face of public opinion, or they could just keep going until their public support goes down to 0, and there's people in the thousands standing outside the Supreme Court. Now, I was telling Michael before this, unlike earlier times in American history, these justices are so sensitive to criticism that if you, like, say, I don't like your suit, they go and give a speech, and they say, this is the end of American democracy. They don't respect how we dress. So it's ironic that they have such a glass jaw, which, of course, let's face it, I was brought up in New Jersey, not in California. If somebody's glass jaw is put out there, you might want to, what, class? Take a swing at them. I mean, rhetorically. I do not favor. See, that's what FDR did. FDR took a look at these folks and he called them 9 old men. They hated that, hated it. And then he threatened to basically throw out their majority. He couldn't get it through, but they didn't know that. And then he went around the country saying, we're not going to have a majority's view blocked by 9 old men. So the truth is, this is also why to go back to the very start, why I haven't given up on a lot of things. This is a transitional period that's just awful. But you can't rule this country from a minority position, rule the majority simply because the Constitution gives you extra votes. The public just won't accept it after a while.
Yeah, but with the court, it seems like we're going to be stuck with this court for quite a few years. And the construction of this court was, you could argue, was based on one of the most nefarious acts in recent history by denying Obama his seat. And then so instead of having 5-4, we now have 6-3, which who knows how long that's going to go on. I do have some hope that Roberts is a little more apolitical and wishes some of his colleagues were. But I can't see Alito or Thomas being so concerned about anybody else's opinion other than their own.
This is a marathon, folks. This is not a sprint. When you're going to turn around the Supreme Court, it's not like turning around an election. It got to this plan, the where it is now, for about 30 years of determined work to get this court. Yeah. And a lot of people think, well, by next Friday, it should be changed. No, it takes a minimum of a 10-year plan, and it's immensely doable. And if you have the majority on your side, 2/3 of that plan is mobilizing the majority to raise hell. Raising hell is a very normal thing in politics, by the way. It's not nonviolent. It's just yapping, So a lot more yapping needs to be done.
Let me switch gears. Let me switch gears a little bit. Okay. Yapping. I'm going to yap. Do we need more Jews in elected office? Right now, in the House, 435 seats, we have 27 Jews. We have 10 senators who are Jewish. Do we need more? And if we do, or if we don't, does it make much of a difference?
Well, if you get more, I wouldn't advertise it. It's funny, that was only half ironic. Back before the 6-Day War, do you know that the feeling in the Jewish community was don't run for office?
That's understandable.
Think it through a little bit, how precarious in many ways the Jewish position was. Don't run for too many offices. Elect people who will protect our interests, but don't be a target. I can't tell you the impact that the 6-Day War had on the Jewish political stance. And this goes back to people like Howard Berman and Henry Waxman and their crew that came up. Many of you remember them as youngsters coming up. And the feeling was, why not stand up for ourselves? What's the matter?
Somebody's calling for the dog.
Oh. Here? Oh my.
Oh, boy.
We've got at least a dozen of them, and they're all specialists in something, so we're going to be fine. I don't know if he'll be fine, but it'll be fine. Yeah, they got 911 on the line. I'm on hold. Oh, yeah, no, they've got it. Oh, they called tonight? There's half a dozen phones. They're not answering.
Hi, everyone. For those watching on the live stream, we just wanted to let you know there's a medical situation and everything is under control. And so thank you for those of you watching.